Is this the face of Anne Boleyn? This exquisite and tiny portrait can be found in a ring that once graced the reputedly long and elegant fingers of Queen Elizabeth I, Anne's daughter. I've had the privilege of working with this ring on several occasions, and to say that it is tiny and incredibly light would be an understatement. The ring was created in mother of pearl, mounted with sheet gold set with table rubies. On the bezel can be found an E for Elizabeth in white diamonds, with an R for Regina in blue enamel. The gold bezel is hinged, and when opened, it reveals two enamelled portraits. One of Elizabeth in fashions from the 1570s, when this ring was most likely made and possibly gifted to the Queen, and the other of a woman in a black gown and French hood, which dates very specifically to the early to mid-1530s. For many years, Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, has been identified as the sitter. However, this isn't an undisputed identification. There have been other candidates posited of who the woman in the French hood is. Before we ask if this is Anne Boleyn, I'm going to briefly tell you why I don't think it is the other women who have been considered. The first alternative candidate is Queen Catherine Parr, Elizabeth's fourth stepmother, and Henry VIII's sixth queen. Elizabeth was undoubtedly close to Parr, but their relationship was troubled at the end of Catherine's life by the disturbing advances made to the then 13-year-old Elizabeth by Thomas Seymour, Parr's fourth husband. Elizabeth parted badly with Catherine Parr and doesn't appear to have marked Parr's memory in any meaningful way during her own queenship. Moreover, as mentioned previously, the French hood in this portrait is from the early to mid-1530s. If this was Parr, we would expect the hood to be shaped in the later style of this fashion, in the 1540s, when the hood splayed towards the cheek, as seen in this portrait of Parr. To me, both the fashions and sentiment seem to be wrong with this identification. The second candidate is Kate or Cat Ashley, governess and later Lady of the Bedchamber to Elizabeth. This identification appears to hinge upon its likeness to this portrait, which is often used to illustrate Cat. However, this isn't Cat, for it is inscribed as her niece, Joan Champernowne. The portrait we have of Cat again shows her in later fashions, as we would expect, so this identification doesn't ring true to me either. The third candidate is of young Elizabeth herself, but again we must question why Elizabeth would be depicted in mid-1530s fashions, when she would have been in her infancy when these fashions were worn. Our earliest extant portraiture of Elizabeth in her youth shows her in 1540s fashions, as we would expect. Moreover, it is unlikely that anyone would gift a ring to Elizabeth which included an image of her in her youth. Records show that Elizabeth fiercely controlled her image, drafting 2 proclamations to control the reproduction of her earlier portraiture, which she reputedly did not like. And would it have been expedient to remind the Queen of her youth at a time when the question of her succession and her lack of an heir was so fraught and acute? I'm not so sure. Lastly, a fourth candidate has been proffered, that the ring features a portrait of Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary. To me, this is the least likely of all of the candidates proffered. Whilst Mary and Elizabeth undoubtedly shared a close bond during Elizabeth's childhood, their relationship very much soured during Mary's short reign, with Elizabeth's life imperilled when she was imprisoned in the Tower of London upon Mary's orders. I very much doubt that Elizabeth had many fond memories of this perilous time in her life, so the sentiments here seem wildly misplaced. The notion that the ring once belonged to Mary is similarly flawed, since conservation reports show that the portraits are fashioned in the same materials and likely by the same hand. The image of Elizabeth is based on a pattern by Hilliard and dates to the 1570s, So these portraits were likely both created long after Mary's death. So what is the case for this being Anne Boleyn? Well, unlike that of Parr or her half-sister Mary, Elizabeth and her courtiers underwent significant efforts to restore and remember Anne Boleyn by adopting and recreating her emblems and, crucially, her image. Many portraits of Anne are believed to, or are proven to, date from the very period when this ring was created. But didn't Anne Boleyn have dark or even black hair when the ring suggests gold hair, you might ask? Well, you might be surprised to know that we have very little contemporary information about Anne Boleyn's hair colour, in spite of the widespread belief that it was jet black. The first reference to Anne having black hair comes from Nicholas Sander, a recusant Catholic, writing to discredit Elizabeth by monstering her mother. Thomas Wyatt may have referred to Anne Boleyn as brunette, which encompasses a much larger variety of colour than black, and this may also be a reference to her dark complexion. Other portraits of Anne show a very wide variety of hair colour, from chestnut to brown and even bright red. Indeed, as Elizabeth was red-haired like Henry, science tells us that Anne has to have had at least the recessive red hair gene. This Holbein sketch of Anne may at first appear to show her with light hair. However, Holbein layered his chalks to build tone, and recent analysis by Dr. Kate Hurd has shown remnants of a darker chalk, which has likely rubbed off over time. So we don't have a definitive idea of what Anne's hair colour was. Moreover, the whole portrait in this ring was created in gold and then enamelled over in differing colours. Crucially, on the hairline, the highest point of the portrait, we can clearly see substantial remnants of a darker enamel, which is likely worn away over time. As the image was protected in a locket, we can imagine that the abrasion of this enamel came from haptic wear, the repeated touching of this portrait as an act of reverence and perhaps remembrance. So with this knowledge of the enamel loss, we can assume that the original intention of the artist wasn't to depict the hair as gold, as it was with Elizabeth, but as something slightly darker. So whatever Anne's hair colour was, this lost enamel doesn't pose a reason to discount Anne. But is this what Anne actually looked like? Well, there are striking similarities between this image and the facial shape and features shown in other images of Anne, including the Most Happy Medal, which dates to Anne's lifetime. There is, however, a very important clue, which has been noted by Professor Susan Duran and historian Jack Beasley. Under the bezel can be found a phoenix emblem. Now, this was, of course, the emblem of Jane Seymour. However, during Elizabeth's reign, it was adopted frequently in her portraiture for a very specific reason, made vividly clear in a poem by Alpen Fulwell. Elizabeth was the triumphant phoenix who rose from the destruction of her mother's ashes. This is a potent piece of the puzzle which, for me, strongly upholds the likelihood of this being an intimate portrait of mother and daughter. We have the right fashion for Anne, a clear idea of why the hair colour has changed over time, the presence of an emblem which Elizabeth and her courtiers used to represent her relationship with Anne Boleyn. And we have the firm knowledge that Elizabeth and her courtiers underwent substantial efforts to rehabilitate her mother's memory in texts and, crucially, in images. As Dr. Tracy Borman's groundbreaking work reveals, Elizabeth cherished her mother's memory in an often discreet but particularly meaningful way. Elizabeth may have had the heart and stomach of a king, but she was her mother's daughter too.